we on? Cool. All right, we're back, and I think we got the timing right. That's rare in our case, I guess. So yeah, episode 2. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, we have slightly better microphones now.
Better mics. The weather's a little bit different, making it a little bit brighter. Hopefully the contrast isn't too high. Yeah, some interesting things happening this week. Had a lot of discussions that are kind of top of mind. Got some questions flown in, whether it was through our own personal socials and or the Gateway accounts. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about some of this stuff. Probably the biggest one this week is the DEA indecision, right?
It's the non-news.
The non-news about the DEA.
It's like, the DEA doesn't like marijuana.
Right. Yeah. So
news.
Okay, so we'll talk about that. We'll also get to kind of the being your own boss mentality. The why are people starting startups, and this fallacy of being your own boss. And then I think we'll round out the conversation with something that came up in our cohort this week. But we've seen it throughout the industry ever since we started. And that's kind of just the mentality of being a founder in the cannabis space, and kind of the barriers and the walls that you need to break down, even if it's not true to who you are or what you are. Fun topics.
Sure.
Maybe we'll have to keep it a little PC, maybe, or not. This is live. What are the rules with Facebook Live? Are they going to kick us off if we get too rambunctious?
I think if we disagree with Mark Zuckerberg, we get kicked off. That
okay.
Seems to be the
so
policy.
I'm Ben. This is Carter. We're the founders of Gateway. You can find us all over the social medias and on the line and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
We'll let you figure it out. But yeah, I mean, let's just get started. We'll try to keep this to 30 minutes again. I think that was a good time frame, and we'll go from there. So the DEA indecision, what does it mean? Are we distraught?
I don't understand why this is news, Ben. Like, I seriously, I'm confused why everyone's like, oh, the DEA decided marijuana is not going to be descheduled. I mean, if you go to anyone with a job and say, would you please study whether or not we should fire you because your job's irrelevant? You shouldn't be surprised when they come back with the answer of, no, it's very important what we do.
Because the DEA is not motivated to deschedule or reschedule, and we can talk about that for a little bit. Cannabis, like, it's not in their interest. In fact, like, if you go back to the 30s, about when the FBN, or the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, were founded by the lovely Harry Anslinger, you just look at the motivations as to why that was formed. Alcohol prohibition came to a close. You had a bunch of federal employees.
We have some employees.
It's like, how do we, how do we fleece these government employees and keep them in jobs, and start targeting
fleece the taxpayers and keep them.
Fleece the taxpayers. Yes. So the whole motivation behind starting these bureaus is.
Well, I mean, look, this is true with any government bureaucracy, right? And probably bureaucracies in general, but specifically with government bureaucracies. I mean, right? Here's how they get measured. Is the thing you're doing working? If the answer is no, then we need more funding to do more of the thing you're doing. If the answer is yes, then, we need more funding because it's so successful. Like, they don't die on their own. They just grow on their own.
Right.
Especially if you task them with making the decision about how valuable they are. I tried to look up maybe I'm just bad at Google, but I tried to look up the percentage of the DEA's budget that's spent on marijuana enforcement. Now, I looked at their budget. They didn't seem to break it down that way. They talked about stuff they had done with marijuana, but they didn't have their budget broken down that way, and maybe they can't because maybe, like, it's just difficult to figure out how much percentage of an agent's time they spend on cocaine versus marijuana or whatever. But if you look at their budget and the reports, like, clearly marijuana is it's like the lion's share of what they're doing. Like, they cite it as like the biggest problem. They brag about all the plants they've destroyed. I mean, it's a big thing for them. So, asking them to potentially cut their budget for enforcing marijuana is literally like asking them to commit seppuku. right? It's like, oh, would you like to hack off a limb and like gut yourself? No.
Right.
And somehow that's news. So we can talk about the schedule. I think most people understand the to get back to this, like nothing changes for the industry, right? This isn't doesn't affect anything.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, literally, like the reason everyone got their hopes up because some a-holes down in Santa Monica wrote a story about, oh, we know someone or heard something from someone where the DEA is considering rescheduling, which the whole concept of rescheduling isn't even that exciting, right? Like if we go from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, that might actually be a disservice to the efforts that we're putting in right now.
There's an argument to make that that's worse. I'm not sure. I don't know where I stand on that, but there's an argument to make that it's worse to move it to Schedule 2 rather than just wait for it to. It's eventually just going to come off the schedule.
Sure.
Right?
And just so everyone knows, Schedule 1 drug. I mean, this
heroin,
ecstasy, LSD, which LSD is also questionable in some circles. But yeah, I mean, it's basically saying that there's no medical application. And anyone with half a brain that is on social media like knows that there is medical application.
Right.
Period.
Right.
And who is the DEA? Like, why is the DEA making these decisions anyhow? I mean, we're talking about like medical application. Shouldn't it be doctors and psychologists?
Yeah,
that
look,
are unbiased.
It's
that
the
are
drug
making...
enforcement agency, not the agency that's supposed to decide which drugs are bad or not, right? And but getting back to the Schedule 2 thing, I mean, I think the issue with Schedule 2, because this is an issue with Hillary Clinton as well, because she's like made overtures about potentially moving it to Schedule 2. It sounds good, right? Because it sounds like it's less enforcement somehow. Right. All it really does effectively is open the floodgates for large pharmaceutical companies to come into the cannabis industry while still prohibiting smaller companies from doing it. So you would get like the Mercks and the Pfizers would be allowed to cross state borders with marijuana and do whatever they want, but everyone else would be subject to the same restrictions that they're already subject to. So it's not clear whether that's a great idea or we should just wait for the eventual descheduling of marijuana.
Because other Schedule 2 drugs contain like what? Cocaine,
right? Cocaine is Schedule 2,
and you don't see edible companies out there making a ton of money off of cocaine. It's
right.
It's like it's not a good deal, right? It's like this is not the same thing as cocaine. This is like a far different category. So it's how it's being managed. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to. I don't want to like. I don't want to derail our show, but I'm kind of like, I just don't want to talk about it anymore. It's not news. Yeah. The DEA doesn't like marijuana because they get paid to destroy marijuana plants. Like, duh.
Yeah, I think the most poignant statement that I've seen, like in the circles around Oakland here, is like, this is why the state efforts are so important.
Absolutely.
We pass it at the state level, and we push it up. It's a bottom up, process.
Yeah, and realistically, it's probably not going to change for the next 8 years. Based on the two presidential candidates that are one of whom is likely to, someone's going to win. Probably not Gary Johnson. So it's probably not going to change. Right? So.
Probably not Gary Johnson. Okay, we digress. But that being said, this this stigma and everything that comes along with this, the prohibition on cannabis and the federal standpoint, it puts us in a situation where when you're creating a company in the space, it's a far cry from the mainstream. There's going to be opposition that puts you in positions where you don't necessarily feel comfortable, or you're not being perceived as, or getting a fair chance like a founder of a tech company or
and there's some legitimacy to that too, right? I mean, there's a larger risk for investors to be doing this.
From the investment standpoint, sure, yeah.
Right.
I mean, even just in general, like talk about like trying to go get insurance or a bank or...
Yeah, although similarly, I think a lot of those are relatively rational. I don't want to defend them, but they're relatively rational decisions by bankers and insurance companies, realizing that there's an added risk here that they have to take on, banks in particular.
So I guess the question arises, like, how do we combat that? Like, how do we create legitimate businesses that actually have a chance, that can get investment, that can be trusted?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we do at Gateway, right? We make sure that they're organized properly, that they're above board, that they're following all the rules. We've got a founder who's helping solve the banking issue, and making federally compliant payment processing for compliant with anti-money laundering laws and know your customer laws and stuff. But banks in particular are just going to be conservative, also just generally, even if it were legal. But I don't know. Was there a question in there that was like it?
I'm just it's come up often, like when we've been talking to people in the community. It's like, I'm not going to give up my beloved weed. I'm not going to put on a face that is not true to myself, right? It's like,
yeah,
like I've heard the argument a lot, and I'm like that's,
okay. So
I respect that. Like I respect the integrity that people have to be themselves and to represent who they are and what they are, and not answer to anyone. However, if they are asking people for money, or if they're trying to get services and support for their business, like, what might be required?
Okay, yeah. So, all right. So you're bringing up. We had a discussion with the founder about this yesterday a little bit. So, the truth is, from outside the industry, there is a perception, which is that people in the cannabis industry are going to be unmotivated and lazy, stereotypical potheads, right? And that's the concern that they have. And it's completely rational to try and combat that concern by demonstrating an excess of professionalism and show that you're not that stereotype. And I think we had some pushback from a founder, right? It was like, I don't want to do that, right? I don't want to screw that, like screw them. I'm just gonna be me, and there's a difference between being principled and being a petulant child. So, being principled is admirable, right? And principles are like moral positions. And saying that I'm not going to compromise my moral position in order to build a successful company is a totally admirable thing to do. And if you end up compromising your morals, you probably end up unhappy with your ultimate success, and B, you end up surrounding yourself with people who like unscrupulous, moral, compromising people, and your life just kind of sucks at that point, and you can't trust the people around you because they're probably also immoral, and that's the environment you've created. So it's both admirable and practical to stick to your moral principles when building a business. There's a difference between moral principles and like your own idiosyncrasies. So when you get into the realm of stuff that's not moral, like whether you shower, or whether you pepper your pitch with Jay-Z quotes, like those aren't moral questions, right? Those are your own little idiosyncrasies. And to say like, oh well, I'm not gonna do anything that would appeal to investors. Like I wouldn't put on better clothes to appeal to investors, and I wouldn't I'm not going to make my pitch deck look nice, and whatever it is that you don't want to do. That's just solipsistic, right? It's this. It's not admirable. It just shows that you think that you think that being a founder is all about self-expression. And this kind of relates to one of the questions that we'll talk about in a minute, probably. Yeah. But being a founder isn't about self-expression. You need other stakeholders involved, and it's a signal to potential stakeholders and investors that you're not cut out to be a CEO if you don't recognize when you have to hold your principles and when the thing that you're sticking to just doesn't matter, right? Being a founder is all about responding to the market, figuring out what other people want, convincing people to voluntarily give up their money and give it to you, either in the form of investment or buying your product.
Sure.
And so to do that, you have to recognize that you need other people, and you can't just say, I'm only going to surround myself with people who love my idiosyncrasies and are completely the same as me.
Well, and this can be combated in the early stages of building your business. Like we're always pressing founders to create their brand foundation, to find out what their company stands for, what the goals are, what the persona is, the voice that their company uses, and everything that you do on the face of your company like needs to represent that, not necessarily
exactly
you, right?
Exactly. And those should be broad enough. I mean, I don't think they should be super broad, but they should be broad enough that you can find a talent pool that would agree with you, right? If I was going to start a company and say, it's one of my values that we only eat in and out every day for every meal. Like, it would be very difficult to recruit people. It would be delicious, right? But it would be very difficult to build a team around that. And
Sure.
I'm only gonna take investor meetings at In-N-Out, like, because that's what I like.
Yeah.
Fuck everyone who doesn't want to meet me at In-N-Out. Like, well, yeah, you could do that, but that's not being an entrepreneur. Because inherently, being an entrepreneur is looking outward at the world and seeing what the world wants, needs, and is willing to, give you either time or money for voluntarily. And so that's not all about self-indulgence and just having things your way for no reason.
So let's take this to the bigger picture. Our friends at Investing in Cannabis recently interviewed Dale Sky Jones of Oaksterdam, and she was talking a lot about the nomenclature that we use in the industry. Whether we're using cannabis instead of pot and weed, whether we're talking about recreation versus adult use, like, and how we should strike some from just our general conversation. And it's
Right.
How is that being translated to the mainstream? Like,
Well, I mean, I think so. Dale's super sharp, right? And she brings up awesome points. And the cannabis thing is actually a great example, right? Why aren't we calling it pot all the time?
Right.
Why are we using the word cannabis? Is there anything wrong with the word pot or marijuana? No. This is not a moral issue. This is a practical issue responding to the market, responding to the fact that there is an irrational fear of pot and marijuana in our culture. And so to clean it up a bit, we just switched names. Like, oh, it's cannabis.
Well, not switched, reverted, right?
Reverted,
to the scientific term.
Sure, but had cannabis been the term that was used by Nancy Reagan and
Sure.
the DEA for years, would be using marijuana now instead of cannabis. It's just
great article, by the way. If you haven't read Carter's Recode article on the ghost of Nancy Reagan, highly recommended.
Yeah, go check it out. But Dale's right in that when you're in, I mean, this is true actually for any industry, but especially for an industry that has cultural stigma that it needs to deal with. You need to look out at the people who are across the chasm from you,
Sure,
and figure out how do I put my best foot forward? How does the industry put its best foot forward and build an olive branch? And you don't do that by intentionally saying, "Screw it, I'm going to do the things that are triggering for them that they can't rationally react to."
right.
Instead, you say, "Hey, let's start calling it cannabis. Let's use the scientific name." Okay, great. Because it's less triggering than pot.
Yeah.
That's a perfectly rational thing to do. Dale's argument about saying adult use versus recreational is another example of that, because people have a negative reaction to recreational drugs and recreational use of marijuana. So she's saying adult use. Okay. Is it a moral issue? No. Is it smart? Yes.
Sure.
And that's the distinction.
Okay. So, going to try to make a little bit of a transition here, talking about stakeholders and having to answer to someone besides yourself.
Yeah. So hold on. I actually wrote this. Hold on. Did I write? I think I wrote her quote down. Maybe I didn't. No, I didn't.
Okay.
But go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, so generally the concept, and anyone that's made their first leap into being an entrepreneur has probably, at least 95% of you, gone through this, is you want to be your own boss. I mean, you're tired of working for the man. You have your own ideas, and you want to go execute on those your own ideas, and so you're going to be the master of your domain, and you're just going to start your own company.
Right.
There's a major fallacy here, right? It's like, you don't have a boss. You have 100 bosses.
Right. It's worse.
It's worse.
So yeah, I mean, being an entrepreneur, like, entrepreneurship's not an island, right? And the way I like to think of it is, for most, so starting a business, actually, like, being in business is actually quite difficult, because you've got this, you look out at the world, you've got billions, but even if just in the U.S., like, millions of people who are your potential customers, maybe, whom you have to interact with and figure out, what exactly they want, how much are they willing to pay for it. Like it's a complex problem, and being an employee isolates you from most of the complexity of that problem, right? When you're an employee working for the man, right, you are given very clear directions usually, and clear hurdles you need to, or milestones, right? And you say, okay, metrics is the word I'm looking for.
Sure.
Okay, you do this, right? Engineer, you write this code that does this thing. We'll handle making sure that we get money for it.
Mm-hmm.
Or even if you're the salesperson, like you go sell these things, we'll make sure that they're the right things to sell and that they work and blah blah blah. Like it's very limited in scope what you have to deal with. But you're being shielded from a lot of the complexity of dealing with a relatively free market full of people who all have different desires and ideas and what they want and blah blah blah. But when you're an entrepreneur, that suddenly becomes your job. Your job is to figure out what do people want, and
right.
how do I do all of the things necessary to do that. And that what that means is, instead of having one or a couple bosses, your boss is basically like everyone, right? Like,
totally.
And what was it? I think it was Phil Libin who was like, I think Phil said this, but he was like, you can't choose how much you work when you're an entrepreneur. You can choose like which 20 hours of the day you work, but you can't choose the fact that you work 20 hours a day or whatever. Like
right.
you can't. It's just you're less in control than you think you are. And so I think a lot of people who are first time founders come in thinking, oh, this is my chance to be my own boss and have freedom and blah blah blah. And it's like, yeah, you're free to choose which of those 20 hours you work and which 4 you get sleep on.
Yeah, I mean,
other than that, you don't have a lot of choice.
This whole topic is a slippery slope because it brings up a lot of things. It's like, communicating with said bosses. How do you do so in an effective manner? Like, how much time does it take? Like, how often do you need to do it? And it's very cumbersome. I mean, we were just talking last week about how you've had to write, the same copy in like 10 different forms so that you could just get it out to the people that needed it, but you weren't disclosing too much information to the wrong people and all this kind of stuff. And it's just, and that was just one subsegment. That's like on the investment side, but then there's the customer side, there's the mentor side, the founder side. It's
right. I feel like much of my job is basically communicating the same information in a different format to different people.
Right. And getting to the time management thing, it's the part of your job that needs to fit into those hours that aren't on everyone else's normal time, right? It's like, we're here in the office 8 to 5, and 8 to 5 taking meetings, and then everything else has to happen outside of that.
Right. Yeah. We have other work to do. Yeah.
Sure.
So, yeah. I mean, I think it is I think it's a bit of there was a founder yesterday, right, who had this issue that we were talking to, and it's a little bit of a shock if you leave your corporate job coming in thinking like, oh, this is my chance to have some freedom.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out it kind of sucks, right? If you're not expecting it. And so, but we saw that at the Founder Institute a lot, right? Where people would come in, think they wanted to be a founder, and go through this kind of, I guess what Adeo would call founder simulation training, right? and realize like, oh, actually, shit, I don't want to be a founder. This kind of sucks.
Sure. Because oftentimes what you find out about being a founder is that you don't get to actually focus on what originally inspired you.
Right.
This happens a lot. What was hot, or maybe still is hot. I think people are getting the picture, but like food delivery, like
right,
super hot, and it was just like, do you realize that nothing that you're going to be focusing on is actually the food? It's like
right. It's all logistics and operations.
Logistics and operations, and that's how you spend 95% of your day.
Right.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I
it's
think
like, congratulations, you got a headache.
Right. You hire someone to do the fun stuff that you wanted to do.
Right.
And you do the stuff you don't like.
So I guess the advice there is to like truly evaluate what you're getting yourself into. Understand that, I mean, being the leader of a company, it's a lot about communications and promoting the brand and voice that you are creating. It's not about promoting yourself. And, I mean, there is an exception, right? If you're a sole proprietor, small business, lifestyle company, there's a whole host of companies that are perfectly fine to build. It's just that if you're looking to build a scalable company that's going to get investment and grow into something larger than yourself, you need to treat it like that, and it needs to be an entity that becomes its own personality.
Yeah, it's a messy problem,
Yeah.
right? It's not freedom, and it's not the image of like running on a beach and woohoo, like this in the wind and having this free life. It's a messy problem that gets dumped in your lap as an entrepreneur, because ultimately everything's your fault.
Sure.
Right. So yeah, I mean that mindset is important to remember as an entrepreneur, I think.
Good. Okay, so let's wrap up what we talked about today. It was a quick 30 minutes.
We should. Has it been already been 30 minutes?
Yeah.
Oh. We should mention. We should actually mention the South by Southwest thing.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
We have a proposal for a panel. There's not been a lot of discussion of cannabis at South by Southwest generally.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's been a couple topics in the past.
Yeah. It's on fire this time though.
Is it? Is there a lot more?
I think I checked and there was like 10 different panels, talks.
Oh, good.
I think, like South by Southwest went through the transition from music and film to tech. Maybe we're seeing the transition from tech to cannabis.
Maybe.
Maybe a little too niche.
That would be great. Yeah. Go to sxsw.gtwy.co. So our website, but prefixed by
SXSW. That just happened.
So
sxsw.gtwy.co. And vote us up. And vote up our other friends. Just do a search for cannabis and you'll find the other talks. We are going to be constantly looking to improve the show, adding better mic holders, hopefully.
Better mic holders, possibly better format to the show.
Yeah, better format. Speaking of format, the next couple of weeks, we'll be probably testing with it a little bit due to some travel schedules and whatnot. So
yeah, and we do, so far the questions have come in mostly like through like personal, like, hey, can you talk about this? Hey, can you talk about that? Tweet us, post questions on Facebook. We'll do that, and we'll love to hear. Well, are you?
I'm
looking
at our comment feed. Sasha's been commenting on here. I told someone yesterday that my work field is in cannabis. She didn't know what I meant, so I explained to her further and used the word marijuana. Her first reaction when she heard the word marijuana was to interrupt me and say, "Why would you want to work with something that can kill you?"
Right.
Marijuana doesn't kill.
Right. Yeah. How many deaths have there been so far from marijuana overdoses? I forget the number. It's a really complex number.
It's about
is it like
it represents the shape of this table?
Is it zero? Was that the number?
I'm fairly certain it's zero.
Yeah.
Anyways, you could do a whole half-hour show on the ignorance around that has been built.
You could, although I think there are people who could maybe do a better job than us. I mean,
certainly
we can talk about startups.
Let's talk about business.
Tweet us your questions, Facebook your questions, continue to email and get us in person as well. But
right.
But yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for joining us. And
shout out to Alicia. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Alicia. Is the secret person in the back who's switching camera angles and whatever else she's doing. I don't know.
It's a family affair.
Yeah.
So, all right. We'll catch you guys next week. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.